Did you know that one of the first multicellular organisms is still thriving today? And that it's undergone very little evolution throughout its lifetime? Finally, did you know that this organism is one of the simplest creatures alive? So, what is this organism? Well, it's the sea sponge. As you can see, the sea sponge has its own phylum, Porifera. You may have heard about sponges on shows like SpongeBob. A lot of information is presented in that show, and I think it's important to point out that not all of it's accurate. I want to teach you more about this amazing organism. The sponge is truly an amazing animal if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective. And there are three main reasons for this. 1, they've been around for over 600 million years. 2, they've evolved very little over this time. And 3, they've achieved incredible diversity. Sponges were one of the first organisms to evolve. They first came onto the scene 600 million years ago. And other than single-celled bacteria, which don't take much energy to survive, sponges were one of the first organisms to endure the harsh conditions of the late Precambrian. And they not only endured these conditions, but they survived 600 million years worth of predators, droughts, extinctions, anoxic environments, oxygen-rich environments, and all kinds of other changes. They even survived the Permian extinction, which killed 95% of the sponge's fellow marine life. To put all of this into perspective, the average lifespan of a species is about 30 million years. The sponges have survived 20 times that length. Throughout this time, sponges have also evolved very little. Some say that the key to survival is evolution. However, this isn't the case with sponges. If you compare a fossil of a sponge to a sponge that's living today, you'll see very few differences between the two. In the Porifera exhibit at the University of Michigan Natural History Museum, there are many sponge fossils. Their shapes, sizes, and the information we can infer about bodily functions is all very similar to that of sponges today. It's really astonishing that there's an animal that can survive for so long through such a wide variety of climates. It may very well be that simplicity truly is better. And a reason why sponges may not have evolved very much is their mode of reproduction. Sponges can reproduce in two ways, sexually or asexually. To reproduce asexually, a piece needs to be torn off the sponge. This can happen due to strong currents or predation, and this piece floats around and lands on the seafloor, eventually growing into a new sponge. Although asexual reproduction is generally associated with not requiring very much energy, this isn't the case in the sponge. If a piece of the sponge gets torn off, it will need to regrow that part of itself, and this puts the sponge at a disadvantage. Finally, it's important to know that this method of reproduction may not even work. The piece of the sponge may be devoured by a predator, or may just land on inhospitable ground. But sponges can also reproduce sexually. A sponge does this by releasing both a sperm and egg. These two cells fuse in the surrounding water and float away. And they eventually land on a seafloor and begin to grow into a sponge. And like with asexual reproduction, the zygote may land on inhospitable ground and not grow. However, it's unlikely to be eaten by a predator because it's so small. And finally, sexual reproduction allows the otherwise immobile sponge to spread out. It's interesting to note that both of these forms of reproduction don't generate genetic diversity. This is because they both use genetic material from one sponge. And even sexual reproduction, which is usually associated with generating genetic diversity, there's no such thing in the sponges. This means that most of the diversity in sponges occurs through rare, random mutations, which makes the species' survival even more astonishing. So, speaking of generating diversity, despite the lack of diversity generated through reproduction, sponges are an astonishingly diverse class. Today, there are 5,000 species of sponge spread out throughout the world, from Australia to Antarctica. They are in fresh and salty waters, tropical and cold, and so on. The sponges that currently live on this earth can survive all types of climates, just like their ancestors. To sum it all up, there are few other species that have survived for so long or achieved such diversity. I hope I've convinced you guys that sponges are truly an amazing creature. They may not tell jokes the way SpongeBob does, or cook Krabby Patties, or ride underwater bikes. However, they've survived longer than any other organism has. 600 million years. They're incredibly tough and adaptable, considering the huge variety of conditions they've survived. And not only have they survived, they've flourished. So, for these reasons, I like to think of sponges as superheroes. They're heat-resistant, cold-resistant, able to survive without oxygen, and have lived through multiple extinctions. They can regenerate, and so on. So, I hope that after hearing this podcast, you enjoy sponges as much as I do.